Hey, welcome to another Tim's Takeaway, and this is, I believe, part 4. Something like that. I believe it's part 4 in relationship to the human body for the EMT class. And my hope and desire as I have planned out what is supposed to happen in this here vodcast, just a little takeoff of the podcast, is to go ahead and complete the body systems for the EMT class. So we'll start off with the neurological location, and we'll start taking a look at that. So let's get started. Alrighty, so here we see a wonderful little description of basically this is going to be the male nervous system. And we can show female nervous system later on if we so desire, but we just needed a model to be shown here. And as you can see, that we have primarily two portions of the nervous system that we're actually going to be talking about. Now, as you can see, this almost looks like nothing more than a big old roadmap. And, from a standpoint, the nervous system is probably the most complex organ system that we have. And a lot of times people will relate the nervous system to something like a computer. And I think at least for this analogy, we'll take a look because there are two different portions that we take a look at in relationship to trying to break these two pieces down. That first one is going to be taking a look at the central nervous system. And that central nervous system is going to consist of the brain and the spinal cord. That's right. So the brain and the spinal cord are going to make up what is going to be referred to as the central nervous system. And when we take a look at something like that, we're talking about the CNS. That would be the central nervous system. And again, we're talking here about the brain, and we're also talking about the spinal cord. So we're talking about those two areas in relationship to being one part of the nervous system. Then we can take a look at the other part, which is going to be if you think of things right like in here, and you can see that as all of these wonderful little areas divulge out, we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system. And this is, again, taking a look and going back to taking a look at what a computer is like when you have your computer that is sitting here, and you have all your wonderful little keys that are sitting in here. And this is the central nervous system part of the computer. And then every time that you have like a little mouse that's hooked up to it, or you have a printer or anything else, this then becomes the peripheral nervous system. So not always the greatest analogy in the world, but at least it helps you to correlate it to something. And that's what we're all about right here at Tim's Takeaways. I know, right? Whole big thing there. So let's go ahead and we're going to zoom in here. We'll get this situated. And as we can see, we have our central nervous system, and we're going to be dealing with parts of the brain. So we'll take a look here, and we can, whoops, kind of went in there a little bit too fast. And as we can see that with our nervous system and getting into our into our central nervous system, we're going to be dealing with this area that is going to be right here. It's going to be the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum actually is the largest part of the brain, and there are 4 lobes that are going to be a part of that. So let's see if we can delete this part here. And let's go ahead and, whoops, we want to get that out of here. And we want to rotate this around. And you can see that the cerebrum is actually divided in half. Now, this area that is going to be, and I'll just show you this with the mouse, right in here, you can see that this actually is being divided up. Let's see if we can get in there a little bit more. There we go. You can see that there is a connection that is right here. And this here is actually called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is actually a way in which the transmission is going to occur across the cerebrum. Now, the ventricles that we had talked about, or I'm sorry, the lobes that we talk about are going to be responsible for things such as hearing, balance, and speech. Now, I just made mention about I forgot what it was. Yeah. Anyway, the ventricles. That's it. So the ventricles. The ventricles are where we would actually start looking at a location for the central part of the central nervous system where the cerebral spinal fluid is produced, and it is actually then moved through all different parts of the body. So when we get into the brain a whole heck of a lot more, you can see that, we're talking about frontal regions, and we're talking about temporal regions, and we're going to talk about, as we get back here into the back, we're going to talk about more of the occipital areas, and so we'll break all these down when we get into the nervous system part of our program. But for right now, we're just giving you a nice little overview as to what actually also happens. So let's zoom in just a little bit more. Let's see if we can bring this over. Okay. So as we're taking a look here, this area right here is called the cerebrum, or I'm sorry, the cerebellum. Cerebellum is also known as the little brain, and this is an area that is responsible for coordinating body movement. And then over in this area, you can see these areas are known as the pons and medulla. And there's also an area in here known as the midbrain. And this area is going to make up what is going to be referred to as the brainstem. Now, the brainstem is the area that controls all bodily functions that really help us live. So these are things that are necessary for life. That includes cardiac and respiratory issues, and it actually helps us identify or regulates our level of consciousness. Now, you also note that as we come back here just a little bit, and we'll just pan this around to this area, and we're going to rotate, and what you can see is that we have our spinal column. That's right. So our spinal column is going to be the area, or our spinal cord is actually going to be the area that is now highlighted. And that spinal cord is an extension of the brain. And this is where a lot of our transmissions are going to be relayed between the body and the brain. Our spinal cord is going to be responsible for communicating. Think of it as a big old wire that transmits messages from the brain to the body, and then eventually it will bring things from the body back into the brain. Now, encased in all of the brain and the spinal cord, we had made mention earlier about cerebral spinal fluid, and that cerebral spinal fluid is known as CSF. So the cerebral spinal fluid, and it basically bathes everything that is ongoing inside of the brain and the spinal cord, and it is a way in which we're helping to protect it. It's almost like a cushion, if you will. Okay, now what you see is went ahead and we continued to re-highlight, or just continue to highlight the spinal cord. The reason that I'm highlighting that spinal cord is because whatever you don't see highlighted in yellow is now going to be referred to as part of the peripheral nervous system. And the idea of the peripheral nervous system is that it is linking up various organs of the body. As you can see, these things are spread all out, and it is actually then going to relay information. Now, it's divided into two parts. We have the somatic nervous system, or more of the voluntary part of the nervous system, which is going to transmit signals from the brain, and it sends it to the voluntary muscles. And this is what we're talking about in relationship to walking, talking, being able to do different things. If you're sitting here taking notes, or you're driving your car and you're listening to this, that's something that you're physically doing. So your somatic nervous system is doing things with those voluntary muscles. We also have the other areas that are now going to be dealing with the autonomic nervous system. And just as it sounds like these are things that are more automatic, because it's going to control our involuntary functions, such as, digestion, or the blood vessels are going to constrict and dilate. And what we'll find with those is that we'll talk more about the part of the autonomic nervous system is going to be the fight or flight response, where we're going to be dealing with the release of chemicals that help with this. And when we start getting into the epinephrine being released and how that's going to increase your heart rate. Or we talk about acetylcholine that is going to help deal with this and reduce some stuff like heart rates. These are things that are going to be referred to as the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. But we'll talk more about those when we get into some further information, maybe such as shock or parts of the nervous system themselves. All right, so with that conclusion of the nervous system, that leads us into our next area, which is going to be the integumentary system, or otherwise known to you and most people as the skin. And the skin, really, when we take a look at this, is one of the largest organs of the body. And it has 3 different layers that we need to deal with. Actually, 2 layers that we'll primarily deal with. The 3rd layer is actually going to be some of that subcutaneous tissue. But what we see here is that our top layer is going to be the epidermis. That's that superficial area that is right on top. And as you can see through this diagram, you can see that this is like the top layer. This is the stuff that you usually see. And the germinal layer actually produces where the new cells are. Then we have a stratum corneal layer, which is where there is a layer of dead skin. And remember that any time that our skin, because it's a living organ, and although we see it on the outside of our body, it is shedding the dead cells. So when you hear, oh, flaky skin, stuff like that, that's what we're talking about. That's where a lot of those dead cells are going to come from. Now, the other area that we're going to be dealing with is going to be the dermis area. And the dermis is going to be a little bit deeper. And here is where we have our sweat glands. This is where we're going to have our subcutaneous gland, or our sebaceous glands. So you hear people say, oh, they have sebaceous cysts. That's where those sebaceous glands, they actually block up and they develop a cyst. We have our hair follicles, which are now rooted and continue to move up. We have our blood vessels that you can see in here. And of course, then we also have some of our mucous membranes. Now, why does this play any role in what we want to do for EMS? Well, remember that we're also going to be dealing with burns and the skin conditions and ways in which that our body is actually responding to different issues. So the skin primarily has 3 functions that we must be able to deal with. It helps protect the body from the environment. So as a result, I mean, if you think about it, it's almost like completely waterproof. Like it's not just water resistant. You get a little pruny and stuff like that, but really it does keep a lot of that water out. I mean, if not, we would probably be like a big balloon with taking in all the water. It also is a way in which we help regulate our body temperature. So this is why you sweat, and that sweat is secreted to the skin surface from the sweat glands. And then we'll talk about different ways in which our body can actually help cool itself. And then finally, our last function of the skin is to transmit information from the environment to the brain. So it lets us know when something is hot. It lets us know when something is cold. And in essence, that's really what we're talking about when it comes down to the skin. Okay, so now that we've dealt with the integumentary system, now we're going to move on to the digestive system. Now, the digestive system is one of those areas that a lot of people are like, oh yeah, okay, it's all about the abdomen. But really, we got to start right up at the beginning. And where we start up at the beginning is actually going to be right up here in the mouth. So when we start talking about the fact that, you know, we are going to have our lips, our cheeks, our gums. This is also going to contain our teeth. This will also end up containing the saliva that we're going to produce because there's salivary glands that are here. And let's see if we can actually just move this in. Here you can see that, you know, we have our mouth and here's our tongue. Here's our tongue. Here we have our teeth. And of course, then we're going to end up dealing with our salivary glands that are going to be up here as well. So once you have taken in that food, the oropharynx is going to be that structure that is more of a tube, and it extends from the back of the mouth to the esophagus and the trachea. So we'll see here if we can get in here just a little bit more and see if we can identify that, right? So here, you know, you're going down, it is in the mouth, and we are now bringing in that oropharynx, so it's going to extend And when we extend, we're actually going to just turn here to the side, and you can see that we are now extending into the mouth, and it's going to come down here into the esophagus. So this area in here is going to be part of that oropharynx. And when we get further to the back of the throat, it's going to be referred to as the hypopharynx, because it's going to be down below where that pharynx is going to be. Now, the esophagus in and of itself is going to be more of a collapsible tube, and really it is about 10 inches long. So it is extending from the pharynx to the stomach. So here we can see that it's extending here from the pharynx, and we're bringing it all the way down here into the stomach. So we'll go ahead and zoom in here a little bit, and we'll just bring the abdomen back into play. And you can see that here is where the esophagus is coming down, and then here is where that stomach is. So if we could turn this around a little bit, let me get it out of the pan mode. And we can bring this around, and you can actually see that the esophagus is now coming right into the stomach. Okay, so it comes right in here to the stomach, and that's what we're actually looking for it to do. So as we're also in this area, what do you think this area, or I'm sorry, what do you think this is right here? There we go. Yes, the pancreas. Okay, and so the pancreas is a flat, solid organ, and it is actually behind the liver and the stomach, so it was actually going to be retro. It's going to be behind, and this is now an area that is containing two portions. It is exocrine and endocrine. Now, the exocrine portion is secreting some of the pancreatic juice, and it has some enzymes that are actually able to help digest fat, starch, and some proteins. Now, the endocrine portion is where we now deal with what you may hear referred to as the islets of Langerhans. Now, we'll talk more about the pancreas, and we'll talk about more of its functions when we relate to the endocrine system in our program. So while we're still here, you know what, let's just go ahead and we'll turn around. And one way to actually try and remember what is happening, or where things are located in the abdomen, is that, you know, if I were to draw a line right about in here, we would know it's actually probably a little bit higher. So let's go ahead and erase that. So if we were to draw a line, it would actually go right here. And this is where we're actually now starting to talk about where in the world is, not Carmen Sandiego, but where is that belly button. So if that belly button is sitting right here, remember, we're now going to divide a line, and this is now where we're going to make, this is going to become the right upper quadrant. This will then become the left upper quadrant. This becomes the right lower quadrant. And then this becomes the left lower quadrant. And this is essentially how those things are going to be abbreviated. And that's also a great way in which you can help distinguish what exactly is there. So let's go ahead and erase that. And again, we'll just draw our line here. I made that up just a little bit higher. But let's take a look at what is potentially inside of this right upper quadrant. So if we look at the right upper quadrant, we can see that we have the liver, and then we have the gallbladder. So the gallbladder, and I'll just point to it right here, is going to be right here. Okay, so we have the liver. Here's the liver. Here's the gallbladder. And that gallbladder is actually something that is distal to it. So we can say, hey, you know what? Let's take a look here. You can see that here is that gallbladder. And that gallbladder is identified here as green. And then when we bring this back around, and let's see, we can put these back up here. There we go. You can also then see that we're also having a portion of the colon. Okay, so we have a portion of the colon, not all of it, but we do have a portion of that colon. We move over here to the left upper, oops, I'm sorry. Let me erase all that. Okay, so if we do this, we have the left upper quadrant. And in the left upper quadrant, you can see that we have maybe a little bit of a portion of the liver that is still here, but really we're talking about the stomach, we're talking about the spleen, and we're also talking about a portion of that colon. Now, in this diagram, because we're dealing with the digestive system, we're not going to see the spleen here. Remember that the spleen's primary purpose is dealing with a lot of the filtration in relationship to the blood. So therefore, that's why it is not put in this area. Now, the right lower quadrant has two portions of intestine, and we have, so this is the right lower quadrant. And here we have a portion of the ascending colon. So this means that it is ascending, meaning that it is going up. And we also have a portion known as the cecum. Okay? So, and another thing that you may find right in here is going to be this nice little appendage right here, which is known as the appendix. And so therefore, we'll talk more about that when we get into some stuff. But that is going to be the appendix, and it can truly cause a little bit of a problem for us, or for some patients, not for everybody. But we'll see more about that a little bit later on. Now, the left lower quadrant, okay, so that left lower quadrant is going to contain the descending, and it's a little bit difficult to see right here, so let's rotate that. Here you can see where that descending colon is, and this means that it is coming down, right? So you have part of that descending colon, a good portion of the descending colon, and then it's actually going to move into the area known as the rectum. And we also have the we also have the small intestine. So the pancreas, the large intestine, the urinary bladder are going to be more in one quadrant. So when you start getting into the abdomen, it can get quite complicated if you're not sure where things are at. So it's always good to go back and take a look at some diagrams. This is just one of them. I'll probably not tell you that they're all the greatest in the world, but take a look at your resources that you have in your book, and definitely make sure that you look for some things online as well. Great way of finding some things out. So, we get back into taking a look at some of these things I had made mention earlier about that liver. Okay, well, that liver, again, which is sitting up here in that right upper quadrant, and it does extend into that left upper quadrant. I mean, you can definitely tell from this example where it is, but it is actually responsible for filtering out some harmful substances. So it also helps form some factors that are needed for blood clotting and some normal plasma production. Now, one other thing that it becomes important is that it is also an area in which it can store sugar. So it can be used for the body when we talk about energy and the way that things are going to work. It also produces some bile, and that's why we have the gallbladder, which you can see back here. It helps produce some bile as well. That is actually going to help in the digestion of fat. A little bit further on, we have to deal with the small intestine, and the small intestine is going to be this area all right in here. It kind of looks like a whole bunch of spaghetti that is here. So that small intestine is going to be hollow organs, and these produce some enzymes and mucus to actually help in the aid of digestion. And there is a duodenum, jejunum, and the ileum is going to be the three areas that we deal with in relationship to the small intestine. So here you can see the jejunum, the ileum, okay? And then all of this, once it comes through the small intestine, is then going to go into the large. We'll go into the transverse colon. We'll go down into the descending. And then eventually it is going to come out of the body through the area of the rectum. And this is that large hollow organ. It is going to be the area that is where the feces is going to be held until it is expelled. And then this is terminating actually at the anus area. Now, the whole purpose of the digestive system in and of itself is to really use some enzyme, produce some enzymes that are going to use or produce for the salivary glands, the stomach, the liver, the pancreas, and the small intestines to actually help break down your food. And then it converts that food into some basic sugars, some amino acids, and some fatty acids. And then all of this digestion occurs, and this nutrition is carried across through the intestine to the liver, and this is where it's now processed. and it's stored, and it can be transported to the heart. And then it is eventually circulated through the blood throughout the body. So you can see that this really links back to our circulatory system that we had talked about just a little bit ago. Okay, so a couple more systems to go in this area. We're almost through it, so bear with me. How about the lymphatic system? You know, this is where it's going to be composed of the spleen. We're going to be talking about the lymph nodes, and we talk about the thymus gland, and then we also realize that there are other components. You know, here you got all your lymphatic vessels, and of course your tonsils kind of play a role in this whole thing as well. But lymph is a thin straw-colored fluid, and it is something that is carrying oxygen, nutrients, and some other hormones into to the cells. And it is also where the waste products of metabolism are being pulled away from the cell. So this is a way in which they're going to be excreted. Now the lymph vessels, they start to form, as we can see here. These lymph vessels are actually starting to form a network that is throughout the body, and it is an auxiliary circulatory system. You want to think of it in that aspect. It's an auxiliary circulatory system. We also take a look at the lymph nodes, and here you can see where they're listing a couple. And, you know, a lot of times I think people hear, oh, my lymph nodes in my neck are swollen. Those are some things we take a look at as well. But these are nodes or nodules that are tiny. They're oval shaped, and they actually filter the lymph. And this is what they help to get rid of the body toxins and other harmful materials. So you hear people say, oh, my lymph nodes are swollen. This is what we're talking about. The filters have actually been engorged because they're trying to filter out some harmful materials. Some other areas we need to take a look at would include the endocrine system, and we'll spend a good amount of time in relationship to the endocrine system through the class, discussing things such as thyroid conditions, or talking about the way that glucose is going to be utilized through the body and how it's going to be transported. The endocrine system is a complex message and control system, and it really gets involved in many normal bodily functions. And the endocrine glands are going to release hormones that are going to be directly into the bloodstream. Each gland produces at least one or more hormones, and they have a specific effect on some organ or tissue or some other process that may occur. And oftentimes I had heard some folks say, you know, if you take a look at through the body and you start noticing like cottage cheesy type things, these are probably going to be areas in which they're going to excrete something, or it's going to be related to some way, shape, or form, something that is dealing with the endocrine system. Now, the brain controls the release of the hormones. So this is really controlled by the way that primary and secondary feedback loops are going to occur. So this is a way in which the body is actually trying to keep everything in line. And if there is any type of deficiency in the hormones, whether or not something is excreted or there's a lot of excessive development of a hormone or not enough, it can really cause different disease processes. So we'll talk about, as I said earlier, different things such as with diabetes, or we also talk about things that are dealing potentially with the thyroid gland. Our next area that we want to take a look at is going to be with the urinary system. I mean, we talked about getting everything in the digestive system and how do we get it out. Well, we were able to take a look at the solids, but what are we going to do about how do we get rid of the liquid waste? And the urinary system helps to control the discharge of specific types of waste materials. And these are filtered by the blood, or from the blood, by the kidneys. Okay, so the kidneys are another part of that filtering system. And really it gets into controlling the fluid balance in the body, and it filters and eliminates waste. And this is one way in which we can control, or your body is controlling the pH balance. It's dealing with that acid-base balance. Now, as described here or mentioned earlier, we talked about the kidneys and the two solid organs. And these are things going to be in the retroperitoneal space. This is going to be essentially behind that peritoneal space. And they rid the blood of the toxic waste that is there, and it helps to control the balance between water and salt. And then we have, from the kidneys, we have a ureter that is going to pass from the kidneys down into the bladder. And when it passes down into the bladder, this is going to be located behind the pubic symphysis, and this is right inside the pelvic cavity. And then it utilizes the urethra as a way in which it's going to empty out into or outside of the body. Now that leads us down to the fact that, men and women are going to be different, and that means that our genitalia have to come into play here. The genitalia really help to control the reproductive process by which life is truly created. And in the male, you can see here that the reproductive system consists of the testes, and we're also dealing with the epididymitis, and we're dealing with the vas deferens, and we're dealing with the seminal vessels. And here we also deal with the prostate gland. And then finally, you deal with the male penis. In females, we're talking about ovaries, and we're talking about the fact that we also have fallopian tubes, and we're also going to be dealing with the uterus. And we'll talk more about all of this when we get into the OB section. And then we also have to deal with the cervix, and then finally the vagina. And, we'll talk more about this, and particularly we have an entire section just devoted to our wonderful female population, so that we can learn to understand all the differences and the problems that they too may have with the way that their bodies are truly designed. So in wrapping up, we got a couple little things to handle, and that is the fact that we have to deal with an area that your book is going to title it The Life Support Chain. Well, let's try to break it down, because this is a very oversimplified version of the aerobic metabolism that actually occurs inside the body. This is something that is considered to be normal. So this is the cell. And inside the cell, we know that the body requires oxygen and nutrients and the ability to remove waste. That is what is supposed to happen. So that means that we have to rely on the respiratory and circulatory system to be able to get these supplies to the cell and then get the waste products out of there. So if there's some type of any damage or any type of interference, these cells can die. So as a result, inside the cell, you have this wonderful little powerhouse that is brewing inside the cell. So the nutrients that we take in every day from food is then converted into glucose. And as we said earlier, we're then also bringing in every time oxygen. When we blend these two things together, we have oxygen and we have glucose, and we blend that into a process that's going to be known as glycolysis, and it moves into an area known as the Krebs cycle. So again, very oversimplified of this. Those that have taken higher level courses recognize that this is very, very basic. So if we were to make it we are making it really basic. The glucose and the oxygen blend together, go through the Krebs cycle. They have created already pyruvic acid, by the way. And they are now producing ATP. And you see the ATP that is here is that whole big explosion. That is the energy. Adenosine triphosphate is what we're referring to as a way in which we store and produce the energy. So the aerobic metabolism is actually occurring. Now, at some point when we are going through this process, you can see that the waste product that we're using is CO2 and H2O. So basically we're getting rid of carbon dioxide and we're getting rid of water. And this is the normal metabolism that's actually occurring in your body. But all of a sudden, if something happens, that goes away. Something happens and it goes away, and pretty soon we're left where a cell is struggling. It's like, I need the energy, what are we going to do? So it goes into backup. And when it goes into backup, it goes into a much slower process. Now it moves into an area that is now going to be anaerobic metabolism. And that anaerobic metabolism is utilizing fat in the process of replacing that oxygen and a lot of the glucose that may be there. And it goes through a much slower, inefficient process to produce energy. So you can see here in the diagram that energy, or the ATP, is much more reduced. There's not enough energy being produced. Likewise, instead of the carbon dioxide and the oxygen being produced as a waste product, we're now producing acid. And this is an area in which it really causes a problem inside of our body. And when we talk about areas such as shock, this is one of the things that we, as EMS providers, can really help get things back to, just by simply oxygenating and properly ventilating our patients. We may be actually able to help change this later on in the process. So when we take a look at the whole pathophysiology of the way that things occur inside the body, we have to be remiss if we think that the respiratory compromise is not a big deal. I think we're in an age now where we realize that hypoxia, which is a decreased level of oxygen in the body, and hypercarbia becomes an elevated level of carbon dioxide in the body. So we know that these things can become impaired. Now, what is depicted here is 3 different areas, just as an example, to give you an idea of how this impaired ventilation can actually occur. Remember, ventilation is bringing the amount of air in. So what can happen is that if we look up here, if there is any way in which that the tongue is obstructed, or any airway obstruction, it is going to actually cause us a problem where we see that the CO2 levels begin to increase because we cannot get the waste product out. In addition, the O2 inside the body is now going to decrease, and this is what is causing us to become hypoxic. So that's an airway blockage. Another type of blockage that we can take a look at is going to be right here in this, our second area, which is now going to be, let's just take an asthma attack, okay? It is a temporary blockage that's actually occurring. We're having inefficiency of the exchange of gases between CO2 and carbon dioxide. When CO2 levels get higher, as we saw earlier, this is going to be referred to as I'm writing the wrong thing. Hypercarbia. So Hyper, carbia. Okay, so hypercarbia is an elevated CO2, right? So that is an elevated CO2. Now, the problem that we have with this is that this also leads back to the fact that what can happen in the brain, okay? So when we talk about some things in the brain, and we'll just give you one that is pretty common right now. We have somebody who has taken an opiate, okay? So if they have taken an opiate, one of the things that happens is it actually reduces their respiratory drive. So the respiratory drive, and we're just going to list it as RD, the respiratory drive decreases. This means that their tidal volume decreases as well. So in response to that, your brain normally tries to say, hey, we need to increase the respiratory rate in that case. But the problem is that the opiate is on board, and it is, meaning that it is on board in the body, and it is preventing the brain from actually responding the way it's supposed to. So as a result, one of the things that we find is that the carbon dioxide level continues to increase because we cannot get rid of the waste product, and we're not now effectively breathing, and now hypoxia is going to increase as well. Oops, I'm spelling that wrong. Okay, so hypoxia begins to increase. And eventually,
what will happen is that this brain will essentially go to sleep. And when it goes to sleep, it means that the breathing, or that, so their breathing at this point goes away. Okay, so when the breathing at this point goes away, it is essentially at zero, and this means now there is no gas exchange. But keep in mind that they still have a heartbeat. And because they still have a heartbeat, this here continues, as does this, in relationship to what's going on in the body. So the production, or the hypercarbia, continues to climb, hypoxia continues to climb, and this is what causes us to have a problem. If we restore their airway early on, we fix all of this. We can fix it. It doesn't require fancy medications. It doesn't require anything more than opening up their airway and providing proper ventilation. We'll find out there's 3 little letters with this, and we can actually do this by effectively ventilating them with what is referred to as a bag valve mask. When we get into airway management, we'll discuss a little bit more of that. Okay? So I think that essentially does it for another episode and concluding episode of Tim's Takeaways. This was the vodcast version. I hope that it was beneficial to you. Keep listening. Hopefully these things are helping you out for your class, and I appreciate your patience. We'll see you next time.